So welcome to the New York Film Academy's Masters of Game Design program. Please come in. Normally, this is when we would have you come in and get settled and relax. This is a program that we do once a month or so, give or take, with essentially we have great guests come and talk to us about making games. The New York Film Academy, if you're not familiar with us, we are a university that we, as the name says, it's a film school. We do all types of great stuff with directors and screenwriters and actors, but we have a wonderful game design school. And in it, we have an amazing faculty of all types of industry experts who will teach you as a hopefully a potential student, or maybe you're a current student, on how to make games and how to launch your career in video game and other game design. And so we like to hold these type of events. We do social events. We do workshops. We just recently had a workshop about how to do paper prototyping for level design. We had a AAA game design workshop. And we've even had one of our, the head of our animation department do a wonderful how to do 3D animation in Maya workshop. And we'll have more of these coming up. So I'm sure many of you have found us through our meetup group. If you're not a member, please join. We have lots of great events and we like to reach out and discuss all types of great gaming ideas and ways to help you become better game designers. My name is Scott Rogers. I am an instructor at the New York Film Academy. I teach all types of game design classes. I am a game industry expert. I worked for almost 25 years as a game designer, doing games like God of War and Drawn to Life and a lot of SpongeBob SquarePants, as well as a Disney Imagineer. I've done VR, I do board games. I was even in a documentary film called Game Master that came out this year. So if you want to learn more about me, you can find it online or just watch that movie. But we're not here for me. We are here for our wonderful guest today. He is a award-winning independent game designer and developer. He has worked for Disney Mobile, Toys for Bob, and Giant Sparrow on titles such as Where's My Water, Skylander Trap Team, and the BAFTA-winning What Remains of Edith Finch. He has formed his own company called The Game Band in 2015, and their very first game, Where Cards Fall, won not only the Unity Mobile Game of the Year, but the Apple Design Award as well. And his latest game, Blaseball, has gained praise from the LA Times, National Public Radio, and Polygon.com. And he was recently named, well, as of last year, one of Forbes 30 under 30, which is a pretty amazing honor. So please welcome a master of game design, Sam Rosenthal. Yay.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Normally we would do this in front of an audience. There'd be thunderous applause. But
I can use my imagination. It's part of game design.
Exactly. Well, welcome, Sam. It's so great to see you. Just for a little background information, Sam was one of my students way back when. When was that? 2000 and I don't know.
2011 or 12, something
11
like
or
that.
12. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. And we'll talk more about your school days in a minute. But we always start the Masters of Game Design program with an extremely hard question. And that is, Sam Rosenthal, what is your favorite game?
It's a tough question to answer because there's so many games that have affected me in different ways throughout my life. But I'm going to give you a few answers if that's okay.
Yeah,
so
please.
I'd say the one that changed my path the most was Flow by that game company. And the reason that one I bring that one up is because when I was in high school, I came across that game when it was a Flash game. It was a Flash game before it was a PS3 game. And at the time, it was the game designer Genova Chen's thesis project at USC. And I was, a high school student that was obsessed with video games, but I was like really into games that were trying things that were a little bit different and, trying to kind of push the boundaries of what the medium could do. So, games like Shadow of the Colossus and such were the ones that were really inspiring me at that time. And, a lot of my friends like were into like Halo and Madden, which like are great, but, I was also like, there's got to be some other stuff too that's like a little bit different, like less about violence and, kind of combat verbs and more about, exploring emotional grounds in video game design. And I came across Flow, and Genova had attached his thesis paper to it, the thesis that he wrote about, what he was trying to understand by making that game as a USC student. So that was my first exposure to the academic side of game design. And it was my first exposure to like really kind of like the thought behind how, like the psychology behind this stuff, like how it actually can work and affect people. And, I did some research, found that this was from USC, and they seemed at that time have like a real, and they still do have like a track record for exploring like new territory in games and kind of trying to like grow directors. So I just set my sights on it, and like I grew up in Baltimore, so going to school in California was like kind of a pipe dream. But I just really laser focused and went to USC, and I don't think I would have ended up in LA where I live today if I hadn't found that Flash game. So I'm really, really grateful that I came across Flow. And then some other games that were just really formative were like the Pokemon games. So much about just exploring a world and like projecting so much of the story in that game like on your own experiences. And those games were pretty limited just in terms of like what they were explicitly saying, but my adventures in that game were my adventures, and when I would talk about them with like my friends, they had their own stories, and that kind of showed me of a different type of power of games where we all have these different stories that we are experiencing that are our own, but we're all kind of collectively enjoying the same type of simulated experience.
Nice. So let me ask a question going back to you finding Genova's game Flow. I find it really interesting that you found it with the thesis paper, which is interesting because that's getting that kind of insight to what a creator is doing in video games is extremely rare. I mean, we can read like articles with little short interviews, Game Informer or Edge magazine or something like that I remember reading when I was working in games. But do you think that it would behoove game creators to release like some sort of manifesto or thesis or something saying, this is my intention of this game? Why do you think that helped you so much when you're playing that game?
Yeah, especially. I mean, it's a tricky balance. I kind of understand to an extent why game designers are hesitant to do it, because like you want your work to speak for itself. It's not have to like kind of explain every little part of it. But when you are making something that is like very much kind of an exploration, and a thesis project is an exploration, like that game did later get a commercial release, but the original intent was not to like package it up and sell it for $20 or whatever. It was, can we make a game that is exploring the flow theory, the psychological theory of flow, and embodies that in game design itself. So if you're exploring that territory, if you're doing stuff that's more on the experimental end, I think it's really helpful to explain intent or express it, especially since like games, it feels like they're so pervasive now, but this is a new form, and the language around games is still very young and primitive compared to art forms that have had like a lot of critical discourse around them for a long time, like film. So, the more that we can describe intent and the more that we can kind of clarify principles and come up with like a shared language, I think the easier it will be to talk about games in a way that is beyond technology, which is like the easiest way to talk about them. Like, literally, what are you doing to make the game? Like when you're working in an engine and all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's the most obvious, right? That and graphics, of course, right? Yeah. You look at the graphics, totally. And you can make a judgment call, but the gameplay, I have a couple of teenagers, and one of them loves to watch the watch you play videos, and it drives me a little nuts, partially because I don't view that as much of a valid way of it. I would much rather play a game than watch a game. And I always tell them, why don't you play it? Let's just get the game, or even worse, I might already own it. And I go, why don't you just play this game instead of watching? He's like, well, I like to watch it and the funny things that they say and all that. And but to me, getting that understanding only comes usually from playing it. So I wonder if the developer does, release their thesis or release their intent of what the game is, maybe that would help the player have a better understanding moving into it. Because I tend to notice that often people will play a game and then other people say, well, you're not playing it right, or you don't understand it, or, and it ends up being this point of contention. And maybe, I don't know, do you think that if the game developers were more transparent about the game and how it was made and what the creative intent was, do you think that maybe the audiences would be a little bit, they're always going to be critical, but do you think they'll be maybe a little less rabid if they understand going into it what the intent is?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a couple different sides to this. On one hand, like, I think all art forms need to have a really powerful critical community around them. And games are still kind of like, there's a lot of great game critics, but they're still sort of finding that voice and finding how they want to think and analyze about games. There are a lot of critics that focus more on commercial criticism, which would, often you see things like criticisms about, like, different bugs or like frame rate drops and stuff, which isn't really about what the game's intent is or what it's trying to express. It's more of just like the execution of it. I think
Sure.
the amount of critics that focus on like the actual design intent or the thesis behind the game, I think those are harder to find still, and they happen a little bit more on the fringes than in like more mainstream outlets. So I think if we continue to kind of foster that type of discussion and continue to encourage it, it'll be helpful. Like, I will say, like, as a designer, like, there's nothing that I appreciate more than a great critique. Like, even if it's negative to an extent, if it's really like analyzing the game and really reading the text and trying to understand it, and then they're engaging with our work in a way that that's really just thoughtful, and I love that.
I find that a lot of that criticism, particularly the thoughtful criticism that you're talking about, often happens many years after the release of the game. Yeah. I in my own experience, literally like a week ago, I found a 5-year-old retrospective of a PlayStation 1 game I had designed in like 1999. Awesome. And it was a really well written, well delivered, thoughtful piece about the game. And there were some things that they brought up as criticisms. It was mostly positive, but I really appreciated it. And I had not very many of my work have gotten that level of in-depth. It was like an hour-long piece on Pac-Man World, which was a game that I designed, and when you're making it, you're in, as you're in a very different type of mindset. Often you are just like, I just want to get this done. I want it to be good, and I want it to be the thing I imagine it to be. But I just want it, I want to get it to launch and then, then nurture it or whatever form it takes from there. So to have somebody else come back and give a lot of, the only thing I kind of wish was that they had reached out to me and said, hey, I want to talk to you. What do you think of this? Or either, I mean, I don't need them to come to me to write their retrospectacle. But on the other hand, I could have maybe given them more insight that they didn't originally have. So I plan to reach out to this person and go, hey, I really liked what you created, and you got a lot of things right. And even the things that you criticized, I agree with. Keep it up. I think that you're right, that encouraging that kind of long form criticism and thoughtfulness, it's you find a lot of it in academia, but not as much of it in the public sector.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I do feel like, not to make this whole discussion of game criticisms, but I think that there's still this sort of mindset that like the job of a critic is to kind of like tell you how to spend your money. And
Yeah.
I think that's very limited. Like the job of a critic is to broaden the discussion. And
Right.
you know, we see that a lot in just more mature art forms. So I'm hoping that we see it more in games. And the other part that you had talked about in that question about like what's the game designer's role in all of this, you know, we
Right.
with Where Cards Fall, we were pretty like shut with our development process until after the game came out. And with Blaseball, we've taken a very different approach where you know, we have a dialogue with the community that's ongoing, that's baked into the game design. And whenever we are doing things that we feel like require explanation because they cause sort of confusion or ripples in the community that, you know, are just create some cause for concern, you know, we are transparent and upfront. And I think it's very, very helpful because, you know, one thing that can be tricky when you're working on a video game, especially if it's like behind a company name. You know, the game band, like my company's a really small company, but it's hard to know. Like it's hard to know, like, is this made by a giant corporation? Is it made by like a small shop? It's just a group of people in a garage. Like, what's the deal? And you know, what's their bandwidth? Like, how many what resources do they have? And they're just being really honest and upfront about that. You know, whenever you're doing something that people are responding well to or negatively to, I think humanizes the people behind it a little bit more and just makes it a healthier discussion.
Right. And I think that the game industry has this weird, I think particularly the fan base where they love the little guys and they love the really big guys. And if you kind of end in the middle, it's like, you know, it's a little tougher to get them to buy into what you're doing. Right. So, you know, I think that was, you know, I'm not going to call it calculated, but I think it was a smart move to, hey, look, we are this many people, you know, we are this little band of game developers, and letting people know, because I think, you know, that's always comes across in our interviews as kind of an endearing part of your guys' business. Now, of course, will that change when you get big? You know, if you get big, whatever the intention is, you know, that you'll have to discover for yourself, I guess. All right. So let me go back. Let's go back a few years, or more than a few years. When did you start playing games, and what was it about them that drew you towards them?
Let's see. I started playing games very, very young. My parents had an NES that was in our house. So like as soon as I was born, there was access to an NES. And I was probably like 4 or 5 before I, you know, had enough brain cells to be able to figure out how to like move Mario. But the first game that I ever played was the original Super Mario Brothers, which is one of my very favorite games to this day. I think like it is such just a masterclass in teaching without saying very much. That very first level of Mario is there's just so much to learn about game design in you know in 1-1. So yeah, I started playing with the NES, and growing up, I didn't have that many consoles. We were always like the type of family that was kind of out and about. You know, my sisters and I had a lot of hobbies. Like I played music, you can see all that in the background, and my sisters were always like going to dance classes and theater and stuff. And I had incredibly supportive parents that would, you know, just drive us to all these places around Maryland. So I basically always had a Game Boy with me, and that was why like Pokemon kind of really captured my heart at an early age, was because, you know, as I was like waiting for my sisters to get out of a recital or something, like I'd be playing a lot of Pokemon. I did have a PlayStation, and actually I had Pac-Man World, which was pretty cool. I enjoyed it a lot as a kid. Yeah, and I was always like really intrigued by just new ideas. Like what I think I loved about games was that, you know, I loved tech and games together. And games felt like a place where, as technology was advancing, you know, they were always like, there was dramatically different takes on the form, like virtually every single year. And I thought that was cool. It wasn't just like kind of like the typical tech thing where it's like, oh, the tech is better, so, you know, here's like a new like tool that you can use with it. Like that was less interesting to me. I was more interested in like what's a new type of play experience that the tech can create. So yeah, like, you know, when games went to 3D for the first time, it was just such a magical moment, you know, to move Mario in 3D space, that same character that I first learned how to play video games with, and now I can and run around a castle in three dimensions. It was amazing. And, you know, I think like as I continued to fall in love with the different types of games that were coming out, I was very much always like an evangelist for video games in my family and amongst my friend groups. But I was listening also very intently to why most of my friends and family growing up and to this day were not interested. They would basically tell me like, look, like this is cool. Like it's really interesting that, you know, there's this high fidelity spaceship that you're showing me, but like every game that you show me, you're blasting aliens, or, you know, it's like a sports thing. And like, I like romantic comedies and there's nothing in this for me. And you know, I would see a lot of people like kind of dismiss that mentality, and I was listening to it. And that's why I think Flow captured me so much, because I saw this game that was just like trying to do something completely different from what it seemed like everybody else in the industry was exploring. And it gave me confidence that there would be a space for me. Like if I wanted to try to kind of push boundaries and make games for all of the people that I loved in my life that were not interested, I would be able to do so, because this was a new form with a lot of, you know, untapped potential.
Right. So you have your laundry list. You're like, I made Blaseball for my dad. I made Where the Cards Fall for my sister. I made
just going down. Once I hit the whole family, I can retire.
You have a big family?
Oh yeah, medium-sized family.
Oh, okay. All right.
This will be a medium-sized career.
Depends on how big it is. Yeah, it might keep you busy for a while. I've actually heard that as a strategy for game design, which is, you know, ultimately you can make games for yourself, or you can make them for somebody else in particular. And so I have a friend who literally has a friend that says, oh, they're into this, or, you know, and I'm going to make a game that they will like. So it's almost like they're making the game as a gift, which I think is a real lovely way to think about game development, is to, you know, they're doing it for somebody, which is very nice. So you know, grew up playing these games, PlayStation and SNES and all that. When did you start making games?
High school was really when I started to make them. I went to a fairly normal public high school in Baltimore, but they had this multimedia, like graphics design, like specialty sort of. You would apply to it your freshman year, and if you're accepted, and you got to take like computer classes through the rest of your time there. And they were very wide ranging. It was focused on like all different types of creative arts. So, you know, we had a semester or whatever the high school version is on like Photoshop. You know, we went through kind of the whole Adobe Creative Suite. And like throughout that, it wasn't just like learning the software, it was, you know, learning like filmmaking techniques and just the basics of that as well. And there was a point in that where we got to make Flash games, and that was the one I was most looking forward to as someone that was really into video games. And you know, I told my parents like how much I was enjoying this stuff, and how much I really wanted to focus on it. And once I had found out that USC had like a legitimate program for this, and had a goal, I think that was very encouraging to them too. And then they encouraged me to apply for like all these different summer programs where I could learn how to make games. So I did that. I did two of them in high school that were both focused on just like more on kind of like the technical end of you know, how to make games. And I'm really glad that I did those, because it helped me put together you know, an application for USC to show that like I'd been practicing all of this stuff. So yeah, the games that I was making at the time were bad. You know, like they were my early games as I was trying to figure it out. But you know, that everybody's first few games are horrific as you're kind of trying to figure out like how all the tech works.
Right. They say you have 10,000 bad words in you if you're a writer, but we don't know how many bad games you have in you as a game designer. Still figuring that out. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Every once in a while, a few pop out of me as well. So when you applied to USC, the program was relatively new. You were there in 2000, and when did you start at USC?
2009 was my first year.
Yeah, there. So that's when I first started teaching, and I think the program was only a few years old by the time I got there.
Yeah, I think the grad program was a little bit more mature, but the undergrad program was still like brand new.
Yeah, I think it was brand new when I was there as well. Why? So, I mean, this was kind of a rare thing. Obviously, there are lots of other places that you can go now to get education in game design. But why should somebody get a formal education in games? Why not just start making games and just, start running? What's the advantage? What did you find were the advantages?
Sure. I will say, like, right off the bat, I don't think there's one way to do this. Like, you don't have to get a formal education in games, and you can have a very successful, path in the video games industry or as any designer.
Yeah, I don't have a formal education in games.
I'm glad that I got one though, and what I liked about it is that USC's methodology for teaching game design I thought was very, very just well thought out and well structured. What they did was during our first year there, we focused on theory. So really kind of learning like the history of games and the more theoretical approaches. And then also on board game design. So we would, paper prototype outside of, before we even touched the computer. And like, this echoes USC's approach in their film school, which is where their games program is housed, where like they spend some time getting the film students like used to the form before they even shoot. And I think for both game students and film students, it's really frustrating at first because you're like, well, I just want to get behind the camera. I just want to like get on the computer. But looking back, what that allowed us to do was really build up an understanding for systems, mechanics, rules, theme, how all of these things intersect without being distracted by the technology. Because as soon as the tech gets in, that kind of immediately starts to become the focus since it just introduces so many barriers. But if you don't have that, you can be a lot more freeform and you can really focus on the creative aspects of it. And I think that helped me build up like a vocabulary for games. And to this day, whenever we prototype at the game band, almost always we start with pen and paper, rather than jumping into digital prototypes.
That's great to hear. I hope that some of my own students are in the audience to hear that, because we as well at New York Film Academy, that is exactly what we do as well. This year I'm very lucky to teach our incoming class, essentially our paper prototyping class, and so I know that some of them are probably gritting their teeth whenever I talk about board games and how we're going to paper prototype things, but you heard it from Sam. It's important. It's an important skill, and that's something that I 100% agree with, and that there are so many of the problems. I maybe my numbers are a bit high, but I always say that you can solve 75% of the initial problems of your game just on paper. Even before you create a polygon, you create a pixel, you write a line of code. You can solve a huge amount of the problems. And then it also gives you this great kind of laundry list of, all right, what do I need to make this game? And now you can spend your time much more effectively in the hardware, after you have this blueprint. I mean, it's like making a blueprint, it's just like architecture.
It really is.
It is.
Just gonna real quick add that I think the other thing that was very valuable about a formal education in games is the people. I got to meet a lot of really amazing young game designers that I continue to work with today. Like the game band is filled with USC grads that I met during my time there and had the pleasure of working with. And we also got a lot of amazing professors. Like I got to meet you there and took your classes, and the professors at USC at the very least like have been really good about keeping that kind of alumni network very close, and just continuing to foster community and mentorship, well after I graduated.
No, that's great. All right, enough about USC. All right,
New York Film Academy. I'm sure program too.
No, all right. So while you were in school, you had an internship with Disney Mobile.
I did.
And so you were there for, by my count, about 6 months. And you worked on 3 different games in 6 months?
It was more than 6 months. I was there initially for 6 months. and then I think like summer break happened or something. I don't know, but I
Okay.
came back. I came back to work for like an additional 6 months, I think. It was a while ago, so I'm trying to remember the times. But originally, I worked there. They brought me on to work on Jelly Car,
Right.
and I was designing like levels for Jelly Car, which is like a physics platform game where you're a car made out of jelly using soft body physics. It's awesome. I had a great time working on that, and they were trying to like make some DLC for it while prototyping a new game, which became Where's My Water. And when that was ready, they brought me on to work on that. And then I came back after the launch of Where's My Water to work on Where's My Perry, which was like the Phineas and Ferb version of it. Which actually, though, like I'm really proud of that game. I think it's like a very elegant, an elegant design that just happens to have the license on top of it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that happens. You end up
Yeah.
working on those licensed things when you're working for somebody like Disney. So what was it like working? I mean, literally arguably your first job in the game industry, this internship is with Disney Mobile. What was that experience like? What did you come away? What did you learn from it?
Yeah. So I'd actually done a few internships before them, but Disney was like in a different league. It was by far the best one. The ones that I had done before, I was grateful to have them, but they definitely were less focused on like working on development and more just like intern tasks, like we need you to like fill out
Right.
this spreadsheet or whatever, which is fine. As a college student, I was just really happy to have like any industry experience at all. But I was really, really lucked out with Disney because I got put on this team, with Tim Fitzrandolph, who was the leader of that team. And they just trusted me, like without really any reason to. They allowed me to at least prove myself, to start making levels for the games that they were working on. And I ended up designing like 20 or so levels for the original release of Where's My Water. And it was great because like that was really how I learned how to design puzzles. And that team had such a wonderful approach to feedback, where every time I would like have a draft of a puzzle, I would just walk up to Tim or anybody else on the team and say, "Hey, play this," and watch them play and watch them break it. And then I would go back and tweak. And then Tim, was really good about like kind of telling me like his philosophy for like what makes a good puzzle, what really makes it tick. And I think like I really started to kind of understand it the more that I spent time in the tool set. And if I didn't have that internship at Disney, if I hadn't had that experience working on Where's My Water, I don't think there's any chance that I would have made Where Cards Fall, or at the very least, it probably wouldn't have become a puzzle game. But that was like a language I was very familiar with. I was very comfortable working within, and really enjoyed working within too. At the time, I hadn't even been playing a whole lot of puzzle games, but once I started working on Where's My Water, it became a genre that I started to absorb and find that I really loved.
Right. Do you play more puzzle games now?
Yes, I really, really love the genre now, so it stayed with me.
Yeah.
This year, my favorite one that I've played is a Monsters Expedition, which is on Steam and Apple Arcade. It's
Okay.
it's really good. It's like if you like kind of Sokoban style games, actually it's the same people that made Sokoban. God, it's a hard game to describe it. You're like pushing logs around to kind of create pathways, but the mechanics, like they're so simple, but they're so rich and so deep. And that's what I love in a great puzzle game, is when one mechanic can actually be used in like 50 different ways, and it just reveals
Oh yeah.
itself slowly over the course of
Yeah.
the experience.
Yeah. The analogy I like to use is it's like the music of the famous piece Peter and the Wolf, where each instrument is this character, right? So you have the oboes, the duck, and the violins are Peter or whatever. And as each of these characters are introduced, they blend and they mix and they create this beautiful music. And I feel that puzzles and mechanics and hazards and things like enemy interactions do that as well. You can get that same kind of music, and the best designers are the ones that can take just that one perfect mechanic or puzzle and just every time they turn it, it does something different. I remember pretty early in my career, I found the company Treasure, the Japanese developers who did games like Gunstar Heroes and Dynamite Headdy and Ikaruga. and they're masters of that. If you get a chance to ever, these are mostly like SNES and Genesis era games, but they are fantastic at just taking one thing and just, milking it until, it sings, right? Like, it's fantastic. Well, that's cool. So did you get an opportunity to pitch anything to Disney while you were there, or were you kind of just guided by what they were doing?
I was more or less guided by what they were doing, but they still gave me a lot of freedom within that box, which is really the most you can hope for as like a young game designer. Right. Actually there were some things like within the Where's My Water, design set. I remember, they got me thinking that, like, as I started to like absorb the puzzle language, I started to look for connections between the different mechanics that we had. To find like interesting ways to kind of bring all of these like small little pieces together to surprise players. And at the time we had an interaction for contaminated water, which is basically like if the water, actually I should probably briefly describe what Where's My Water is for anybody that hasn't played it, but Where's My Water is a physics puzzle game where you are basically like guiding water to this little alligator's bathtub to fill up the bath. And it sounds simple, but it's a logic puzzle game and combined with physics puzzle. So you're trying to like create the right path with like the right momentum to get the water to wherever you need it to go, while also like mixing it with these different elements that come into play. One of these is contaminated water, which has a positive effect, which is that it can wipe out algae, but it has a negative effect where if it touches clean water, it immediately contaminates it. So in all the levels where it comes into play, you wanted to first find a way to use it to clear a path while also draining it. So then you could use the clean water and get that into the bathtub. There was another mechanic that was like a bomb or like a mine. And if water touched it, it would kind of explode. So I was looking at the contaminated water and this like goo that they had just introduced to the game too, that was doing something else. And I asked him, what happens if the goo and the contaminated water touched? So I understood what happened if the goo touched regular water, if it touched bombs, if it touched all those things, but we didn't seem like we had solved this case. And he said, I don't know. And then I pitched, well, what if it creates the bomb effect, like a chemistry set? So like we already have this interaction with the bomb. If these two together, it can be like the thing that kind of creates that interaction. They liked that idea. It ended up in the game, and I got to design a whole bunch of puzzles around it. So like that felt like a really big win, as someone that was like still a college student, to be able to kind of look at these different pieces that we had, come up with something that felt like an elegant solution, and get that actually in the game.
Nice making that connection. Good work. So when you graduated, you went to work for Toys for Bob.
I did, yeah.
Skylanders Trap Team, which is what, the fourth Skylanders? Fourth Skylanders, okay. So what was it like coming on to, this was Skylanders was a huge franchise at the time. What was it like coming into a game that already had several installments and was already this kind of big thing? Like what challenges did you find as a creator coming into it?
I think the first was like having to understand all the work that had been done up until that point, what the design philosophy was and what the appeal was. So you're not like bringing it into a direction that is just like counter to the philosophy. And I will say the designers at Toys for Bob were great teachers. They were really good at like upholding what the values of that franchise was. So when I came on to Skylanders, before they put me on to like what my actual job ended up being there, which was, they call it a playable character designer. And I described that as kind of like if you're sort of like designing a move set for a Smash Brothers character, where their process is, they have like the art for the characters. It's dictated by the toys. So the toys would come in first. And then, we would see like what the image of the character was supposed to look like and prototype a move set for it, like kind of figure out what it's supposed to feel like in the game. And yeah, like I have actually one of my Skylanders right here. It's this Funny Bone, who was the first one that I designed, a move set for.
Nice.
But before all that, they had me first like work in their tool to just make a game, to understand like what their proprietary engine could do, and at the same time, they started. I think the first thing they were having me do was like port characters because Skylanders had to have backwards compatibility for all the other ones. So it was like port some of the older characters in to kind of get a feel for what they could do and what the design philosophy was. And one of the things that they always kind of reiterated was that what they called the out of the box experience. The out of the box experience had to be great because this was a game for primarily children. And a lot of the stuff that I like to do as a game designer, like what I just kind of described with Where's My Water, was like looking for like synergies between different mechanics. And I was like immediately where I was, trying to go. I was like, okay, we have like this move, and together, like they can create this effect. And the designers like would very calmly say, stop. Let's first focus on what happens when you mash the A button, because that is what most kids are going to do for 95% of the experience. And that has to feel amazing and be really rewarding. So I think like looking back at that job, what I really got out of it more than anything was like a very nuts and bolts kind of fundamentals of game feel. Like really kind of how to make a character's like the most primitive actions that a character can take feel really engaging and rewarding before you start to layer on like all of the kind of intellectually interesting things that game designers love to do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's like the beauty of Mario 64 is that many people would fire that game up and they would just run around the castle for an hour, because it just felt so nice to run and jump and swim and you weren't in any danger. There was no gameplay in the traditional sense, but there was play and letting the player discover that first, because you're right. The first thing they're going to do is just mash all the buttons and whatever they do has to be amazing. It has to be like, ooh, how did I do that? I want to do it again. And them having this was something that, I learned as well when I was doing Maximo. And Maximo was this little game with a guy with a sword and a shield. And so we had to make sure that everything that this guy did, you had a very clean image in your head of what, I press this button, he stabs forward. Oh, this is the forward button. Oh, I hit this other button, how he chops down. That's the down button. Oh, I press this other one, that's the shield, right? So having that very clean correlation between the button press and what the character does on the screen. Yeah, that's a great lesson that I'm glad that those guys taught you, because it is extremely important. And it's very tough for game designers to remember that the thing that we're making are for first-time players. Mm-hmm. Like we get very, I call them designer blinders, right? You get this very focused. You're thinking about all the interactions and cool things you could make or whatever. And you just have to remember, well, wait, what's it like when, I have to put myself in the shoes of that consumer, because they might only just play it once. So I have to remember, like, what's that first time like, and so, well, that's great that you were able to learn that. So just as a side note for all of you watching, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. And a matter of fact, we got a really good question here from Katie. And Katie asks, speaking of puzzle games, can you speak to how to design puzzles? Because they feel like that most of the literature on puzzle design are environmental, but there's probably a lot more to it than just that.
That's a great question. I kind of to just start with the point that you made about environmental puzzles. There's, I think, a couple different like overarching styles of puzzle design that are very, very different from each other. So when we talk about puzzles, like, we often look at it like this just all-encompassing category. But environmental puzzles, I usually think of them kind of like adventure game style puzzles, which in my mind means that they're all based on kind of context clues in the environment rather than a language that you are building up over time. Both are completely valid types of puzzle design, but very different types of puzzle design. The type that I have focused on for most of my career as a game designer is logic puzzles. So Where's My Water, Where Cards Fall, these are both logic puzzle games where you are basically like teaching players the fundamentals of like a vocabulary that you're then going to twist and change and evolve as the game goes on. I learned a lot of the principles that I still use today from Disney with puzzle design, and what they would really talk about a lot is basically like introducing each mechanic in isolation as you begin to kind of teach players how they work in the simplest way possible. So the very first thing that you do in Where's My Water, the first level of the game, is you drag through the dirt to like cut a straight line, which then drops the water directly into the tub. And they're able to do this without much of a tutorial because like you have really one option. You limit the play space that the player has one option, and then they can make that connection in their brain. And that's kind of what you're trying to do early on in puzzle games, is create a situation where the player is forced into making that connection themselves, because they'll remember the connections that they make themselves later. But if like you just teach them by explicitly telling them like this is what you do, they're probably going to forget it. So and that's why those kind of tutorial puzzles are so important. And Where Cards Fall, our version of it, the first thing that you do is you create your first house of cards. There's only one space for you to make it in, unlike later in the game where there's a whole lot of them. And then you realize that, okay, like these things can be used to fill in gaps, which then I can use to traverse through the space. As far as like, once the player has kind of developed the vocabulary, how do you make the puzzles interesting for them? I have a couple of different principles that I stuck with all throughout the puzzle designs and Where Cards Fall. One of them was that every single puzzle piece needed to be used in at least 2 different ways to justify its inclusion in the puzzle. The worst types of puzzles, I feel like, are the ones that feel like they are very one-offy, where they have different puzzle pieces that are just used for one specific thing. It doesn't feel as elegant. So in Where Cards Fall, the puzzle pieces are the card piles. So in every single puzzle in the game, you will at minimum create a house of cards with each card pile in the level in 2 different places, which shows how you can.
I was gonna say that's just smart production too, though, right? Because why make something that
sure.
you're only gonna use once?
Oh yeah, totally.
Right. I mean,
there's definitely a production side of it.
Oh yeah, the more use you can get out of something. I mean that's a great design philosophy, just from not only a creative reinforcing that with the player, but from a financial point of view, which as us creative type don't want to think about that aspect of it. We have to be responsible creators, because these things cost money and time, and a lot of times it's not just us, it's other people's time. And I think that that's a really wise way to go with your design.
Yeah, definitely. Beyond the puzzles, like anytime we wanted to introduce anything in Where Cards Fall, that was like the first line of defense was, is this going to be something that we use once, or is this something that we can use, all throughout the game? If it was the latter, then there's a much stronger case to include it in the game. If it was a one-off, at the end of the day, I think we cut every single one-off that we had proposed, or the vast majority of them, which is it's the right thing to do, because from a design standpoint, because it's less elegant if you have a lot of those, and also from a production standpoint, because it costs a ton of money to just make something that's only to be used once.
Yeah. And that said, you can always go back and revisit those ideas and see if there is another way that you can treat them, if you do a sequel or something like that, right?
Totally.
Save it for the sequel.
Save it for the sequel.
So just last question about Skylander, which was, what was it like making things that then were turned into these physical objects? And I guess as a side question, what was your favorite Skylander that you made, or maybe even one that was made before you got there and that you grew fond of?
It was really surreal seeing the physical objects get made, because there's like multiple points of it feeling very surreal while working on these characters, because oftentimes like the original concept that they would hand us would sometimes be what the Skylander ended up being, but oftentimes it would change throughout production too. Sometimes it would make our jobs harder when that happened. Like there was one Skylander with the original concept when I was working on it. The toy had no weapon, which I was excited about because that meant I could do anything that I wanted. Then they later gave it a gigantic sword, which meant that I had to go back to the drawing board and change what its entire moveset was. But it was really exciting. Like when we were prototyping these Skylanders, we were using assets from other Skylanders. So, when I was prototyping Funny Bone, I was using the Spyro model for like almost the entire time for months. So I was looking at Spyro. I had like put a bunch of like, effects to kind of like sort of make it feel like what the Skylander was going to end up being. I had a little glowing green dot where the tail was going to be. As in my design for Funny Bone, I had a lot of the powers coming from the tail. Because in that original concept, it was like this green gem on the tail. The tail just seemed like that had to be the energy source. And then once we got the model, that was the first like very exciting. Oh my God, this is going to turn into a real thing. Because all of a sudden we're working with like the actual character asset, and not just like some spliced together stuff for a bunch of existing Skylanders. And then when the toy would come out, Toys for Bob did a really good job celebrating when the toys would come out. They made it a big event at the studio, and yeah, it was so cool. We were always like excited to see where our toys were going to be released to. Like, was it going to be in the starter edition of the game? Was it going to be in like Series 1? Because that's a whole thing with the toy market, that you don't really consider as much with video game design. So a lot of players experienced some of the characters that I worked on like months after the game came out, which is cool.
Right.
So yeah, I'm obviously like very drawn to Funny Bone being the first one. There's another one. I think it was called Shamrock. Now, I like most of my Skylander memories are still the code names for the characters, not the shipping names, because I would spend like 6 months with these titles that just get in my brain and I cannot get rid of them even, after like the official ones came out. And I still want to call, I probably shouldn't say what the code name was for Funny Bone, but it takes some work for me to call Funny Bone every time. But Shamrock was like this, I want to say she was a fox, and she had these like big green blades on both of her arms, and I wanted her to feel like the Assassin's Creed character in Skylanders. This was also the one where I got to like really go crazy with my synergy ideas. So she had a couple different moves. She could lay out clovers in the ground, and if she was walking inside the clovers, she was invisible to enemies, and all of her moves coming out of the clover would be like a powered up version of her attack. So it was kind of like a stealth attack. That was just like very satisfying for me to be able to like introduce some kind of weird stealth mechanics into this children's game. So I'm just really glad that all got through.
Yeah, that's cool. That for me is those kind of, they're not quite in jokes, but they're in references.
Mm-hmm.
We did when I was at THQ, we did a Danny Phantom game that was inspired by Ikaruga, where it was like, shooting the white dots to kill black enemies and the black dots to kill the white colored enemies. And that's like a classic Japanese shooter. And we were like, let's do a kid. We love that game. Let's do a kid's version of that game, and so, yeah, that kind of inspiration, right? The things that you are interested in coming through in the gameplay, being able to, homage, Assassin's Creed or something like that that's a lot of fun to hear that. It definitely, for, us that have played the games, it makes more sense now, right? It's like, oh, of course, that's totally what it is. So from Skylanders, you worked with Giant Sparrow on What Remains of Edith Finch, which is a really lovely and unusual at the time game, even probably still to this day. What did you do on that game, and what did you learn from working on that game?
Yeah, so I'll say the reason that I joined Giant Sparrow. Yeah, the reason I joined the studio there's a couple of reasons. The whole time I was working at Toys for Bob and Giant Sparrow, in my evenings I was working on Where Cards Fall. So I was still like looking for a way to turn that game into a reality. My friend Brandon that I was working on it with was back in LA, so I wanted to be able to work with him in person a little bit more too. So coming back to LA was a huge draw. I also missed all my friends in LA. But then the other thing too is like I loved working on Skylanders. I learned a ton from it. But ultimately, like the types of games that I wanted to be making were more experimental narrative pieces. And Giant Sparrow had made one that I really loved. They made The Unfinished Swan. I really enjoyed that game and just could tell they were a studio that was trying interesting things. And I had a friend that worked over there, Chris Bell, And when they put out their job post, I was just like, hey man, like I'd love to just talk with you about this. And he was kind enough to kind of share with me what they're working on, after I signed an NDA, of course. And I just fell in love with the concept. Like there's so much about Edith Finch that spoke to me right away. I'm a huge fan of Gothic literature, stories that are more surreal, weird fiction, and just like very human approaches to games. It was a very personal story that was trying to reckon with like a lot of hard to reckon with themes, and that felt like a really interesting design challenge from both the storytelling perspective and from the game design perspective. It also felt very freeing, from a game design perspective, since it was a game that was being kind of pitched as an anthology, both in terms of like tone and mechanics. So you're going to have a lot of different types of like small stories within the game that have different types of mechanics, which seemed like just such a cool way to go. So yeah, I joined the studio, and my role there was a technical designer, and that was kind of my role after the fact. Like when I looked at the credits for Edith Finch, I was like, oh yeah, I guess that's what I was at Giant Sparrow. But it was a very different type of experience than Toys for Bob. Toys for Bob was a AAA company, hundreds of people at that studio. I had a very defined role, and they knew exactly. Like playable character designer was my title there. It's like so many words because it was so specific. There was a team of people doing it. They knew exactly what they wanted for that role. Giant Sparrow didn't quite know as much. They knew they needed somebody that would like kind of understand the tone of the game, had a technical enough background to be able to do a lot of different things on the design side. What a technical designer tends to be in the games industry is sort of the bridge between designers and programmers. They're usually a designer that can program, but beyond that, can speak to the engineers, understand like what the technical constraints are of the project, communicate those to the designers, and kind of come up with solutions between those two worlds. And at Toys for Bob, while I wasn't like coding, I was scripting like the entire time there. It was basically like a pure script design job. There's no level design in my role there. So I got pretty comfortable with the technical side. And at Giant Sparrow, they had originally brought me on to do some prototypes for some of the stories, but then when I actually enjoyed the studio, they were jumping right into vertical slice. And vertical slice, for a small team of, I think there were like 12 or so at the time, and they had to prove to the publisher, that this was going to be a cool project. High stress situation to get thrown into, and they basically wanted me to kind of just like help out where needed, where wherever there were things that were sort of falling apart. I think the first thing that I worked on there was bringing in some of the buoyancy code from the Unfinished Swan into Edith Finch, which was used in the bathtub story in the game. Oh, yeah. I worked on like small things like collision for some of the stories. I worked on things like prototyping some of the swing set controls, or the prototyping controls for a lot of the different types of stories, and ones that got cut as well. And a lot of just like kind of general sort of technical tasks that needed some support. There was some like creative writing meetings as well, but I'd say like my role there felt like I was kind of a support person. And I sort of treated my time in the games industry, like I always wanted to start a company. So I sort of treated all my jobs as like, this is grad school and I'm going to get paid for, I'm going to learn as much as I possibly can from all these different studios. And Giant Sparrow, the way that they kind of operate was they would generally hire people as contractors. Like I had a set amount of time there anyway. It was a good amount of time, but like I wasn't going to be there for the rest of my career. So I was grateful to be able to learn as much as I possibly could there, because they had me working on something different. Like sometimes it was every week, sometimes it was every day. And I got to touch like so many different parts of that project, and just learn a ton about like how, not just how one particular discipline of games are made, but kind of how every single discipline fits into the puzzle.
Right. Yeah, kind of that generalist background that used to be very common, and then for a long time wasn't. And I say it's, depending on the company, it's probably more common now, right? Than than it was
For
before.
smaller companies, I think so. Yeah. We have, I mean, basically everybody at the game band is a generalist to some extent. Like I think of Joel, who I met at USC, and he worked at Disney as well. And he is like an amazing programmer, also an amazing game designer, also an amazing writer. So like, and he can fill in so many different roles, and he does on a day-to-day basis. And people like that are just so immensely valuable, especially when you're small.
So that's a interesting question, which is finding partners. Like, where did you find your partner, your bandmates? And what advice do you have for somebody who wants to make a game and it needs to find collaborators?
Yeah, honestly, like there were really two places that I found them: school and my jobs. Like that's basically it. And outside of that, I met a lot of people through those two main sources that ended up joining the game band. So like I brought on some people that I had worked with at USC that I knew were awesome, and I brought on some people that I'd worked with at other companies too. At Giant Sparrow specifically, especially like given how they operate, where most people there were on kind of like fixed timelines. Um, I brought on our lead artist Corey. He was on the Giant Sparrow team. I was there, and then Steven, who is one of our narrative designers, and I can't even call him a narrative designer because he's just so much like writer, narrative designer, game designer. He's one of the key voices behind Blaseball, and was also one of the key voices behind Where Cards Fall. And he was also a key voice behind Edith Finch. So, it was great to work in those places and meet these really talented people that I could then bring on board. And then since they all worked in the games industry and made their own connections, they introduced me to a lot of other really talented people too. And that's kind of how it all gets its start.
Yeah, I think that's how it always works, right? I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know. Have you ever gotten a job that wasn't through a connection?
Um, Disney, I kind of cold applied to, but it was an internship. So,
Right.
it's a little different. Um, Yeah, like Toys for Bob, there was still a connection because one of my professors at USC was he was an executive at Activision, and I think
Right.
recommended me for the job. So that helps, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It really is about making those connections and then seeing what opportunities come up. So that's great that that you were able to have those. Um, So let me ask you about Where Cards Fall, which seems like a project that has been with you for a long time.
yeah.
As you mentioned that you were working on it while you were working at Giant Sparrow, and that's back in 2014. So how much earlier than that were you working on this idea?
Uh, in total, it's been with me for like a decade. It
Oh, okay.
yeah, I started. So the origins of Where Cards Fall were honestly in my freshman dorm room at USC. I was listening to Radiohead like a lot of college freshmen, and I mean I love Radiohead, so it's not just college freshmen. Um, but yeah, I was listening to In Rainbows and the song House of Cards, and that song I love that song, and I always kind of interpreted it as somebody that is like asking an estranged lover perhaps to leave their stable life behind and come form something new with them. And I just thought the idea of like knocking something down in your life that feels very stable and building something new was beautiful in a way. And cards are such a game piece, a classic game piece. So it felt like this might be, ripe to explore in game design. And I didn't quite know what that was going to be just yet, but in my freshman dorm room, I prototyped a physical prototype of a game about building houses of cards, and that was
Nice.
very very different than what I ended up with. It was like more systemsy than Where Cards Fall turned out to be. Every single card in that prototype represented like a person or occupation, and we would put them together in these houses. And the idea was they would interact with each other based on the cards that you chose, kind of like The Sims in a way. But
Yep.
it became very complicated very quickly. Like it was not a elegant system. It was not a easy to explain one. So, I tried that I was like really stuck on it. I think I was an early game designer, and, early game designers like get stuck on ideas. And I felt like this is this has to be the approach. I'm trying to make it work. What's that?
It happens to all game designers too.
Yeah, I still do that to this day. So I shouldn't say that I've grown out of it, but I was pretty stuck on this approach of, every single card represents a different person, and it's going to be like a big governing system around all this stuff, to the point where I was prototyping digital prototypes as I was learning how to use Unity and just kind of work in USC. And I was always like on that idea. And then once I got into my senior year at USC, I pitched the project to the school. They had this class there called Advanced Games, where you get to work with a team of students for a year on a project. They accepted the idea, and as I started to dive into it with a team, then I fortunately had a great team, and we all kind of collectively realized that this approach is a dead end, and we were going to have to scrap it and find a new way to explore this theme, and find a new set of mechanics that could help explore this theme. I had already worked at that time with Disney on Where's My Water, so we started to prototype puzzle ideas, and actually a puzzle game ended up being a great fit for a game about exploring fragility. And especially we later turned it from something that was very broad and about tons of different types of people to one person, so we could bring it more into our own personal experiences, and then focus it on memories, where you're looking back, and we can marry the process of reflecting with the process of solving a puzzle. And the two of those already kind of seem like they go hand in hand. So I left USC with what felt like a really promising prototype for this game. I didn't have much of a story, but it had the core interactions. It had a tone that was very ominous and interesting. And that was that. But we all, my whole team felt like it was worth keeping going. So a few of us kept it going on the side for years. And I started pitching it to publishers when I was at Toys for Bob. It was early at the time, and it was a very different time in the video games industry, where this was a project that we were prototyping mostly on iPad, and we were pitching it as an iPad game. And mobile was kind of you were either going to be making a Candy Crush style free to play game, or you're going to be pitching a big console game. And that in between space, it didn't really exist. So over time, I ended up meeting the folks over at Snowman, which is a Toronto-based studio. They're known for the Alto's Adventure games. And I met them because I started a design blog while I was working at Toys for Bob, where I was just interviewing designers, game designers, app designers, and they read it and they reached out to me to playtest Alto. And they were also doing their own blog. So there was a natural connection there. And we just kind of became friends through that. We met at GDC, and I showed them what was then called House of Cards. This was before the Netflix show came out. And they liked it. And later on down the road, when I was working at Giant Sparrow and getting close to the end of my contract there, they were like, "How's it going with House of Cards?" And I was like, "Well, I pitched it for a while for publishers. I don't know what's going to happen with it." And they were like, "We've never published a game before, but we love this game and we like you. So maybe there's a way that we can make this work." And that was really how it all got its start. They gave me a little bit of money to start a studio and bring on a few people, and we got to work.
Nice. Now, how did you, obviously it was a long process, and there were a lot of great opportunities that presented themselves. But in those moments where you weren't sure, how did you keep your inspiration going through this?
I think a lot of it was just general hope and faith and naivety. I really believed in this game. I felt like it was a game that was, if we didn't make it, nobody else was going to make it. It was a very different style of a video game. It was a game that was exploring normal life, and that felt strangely radical in the video games industry. There's a lot of games that are exploring these gigantic kind of otherworldly events or battles between good and evil. There wasn't a lot of stuff that was just muted slice of life stories about everyday life, and paired with a kind of surrealist puzzle mechanic too. So I loved the game. I loved it, and my team loved it, and I felt like there was something here, and it just hadn't found its home yet. So and I liked working on it. You know, I enjoyed, like, even though it was exhausting to go home and after working on video games all day to continue to work on video games. I loved working on it, and it just felt like this like catalyst for so many, like every single like game design idea that I had. You know, I could find a way to apply it into that game. So it was like this just like little creative outlet that kept me going. Not just because like I was hoping that it would find a future where I could make it in the form of a video game studio, but it kept me going because creatively I found it very fulfilling, and you know, I wanted to have that creative freedom. And you know, I was working at video game studios that I liked, but like the vision was dictated by somebody else, and they were pretty like hierarchical styles of video game studio. The way that we run, the way that the game band operates is different than I think the way that most game studios operate. Like I give a lot of power and freedom and authorship to every single person that walks in the door, because games are a collaborative effort, and I think like there's so much more rewarding to work on when you feel like you actually have a lot of creative ownership over what the game is. And just in my experience working in the games industry, like as soon as I felt like I didn't have a lot of creative ownership, I would start to look elsewhere or start to put all my effort into my own projects. So yeah, like that was where Cardsoul was giving that to me, and that was why I kept going with it.
Well, that sounds great. It sounds like you're cultivating a fantastic environment. My resume is in the mail.
Oh. I hope
so. So where cards fall, obviously, ended up winning the Apple Design Award and the Unity Mobile Game of the Year Award. So congratulations on that. Obviously, that perseverance paid off. So what advice, so in 2020 now, having gone through this long experience for this game, what advice would you give to somebody who's like, hey, it's 2020, I have my own wonderful idea for a game. How would you tell them to get started?
Yeah, I would say, like, first, if you can, gosh, it's really hard this year, but my first advice would be to find people that you trust and like working with, is it is way easier to channel your energy into something when you're doing it with people that you like than doing it completely alone. And I think the beautiful thing about video games is that they are inherently collaborative. Like, you can make a game by yourself. It's going to take you 40 times as long, and it's going to be really hard and grueling. I wouldn't recommend it. But if you make a game with other people, then like you're getting to see so many different perspectives and use what a lot of other people are good at. One of the reasons that I named the studio the Game Band is because I like games kind of like everybody is playing a different instrument. Everybody's a specialist in something different, but they're all coming together to make a cohesive sound. And that's one of the very nice things about it is you have engineers that have like a very different way of not just like looking at the game, but like a different attitude that they bring to the project. And I don't mean to like generalize engineers or anything, but these different people with different disciplines that are operating in a different headspace on a day-to-day basis, they'll have to come in and work well with each other and communicate well together and make something together. So if you can find people that you like and like working with, and all are bringing a lot of energy into the project, that I think is step one. Step two is, I would say, like, don't rush. I see a lot of like indie game designers or student game designers or so, like trying to like package up their thing really quickly or like throw it on Kickstarter or get it out there. And you don't have to do that. Like, you can just kind of let it simmer, like work on whatever you need to be working on in your day-to-day life and keep this thing going until it finds its home. Because the way that I at least look at the video games industry is that it changes. I think like it changes dramatically every 6 months or so. Like something happens that comes in and like becomes the new it thing on a 6-month basis, whether it's like battle royale stuff or weird web-based role-playing games like Blaseball. Stuff happens very quickly all the time.
Right.
And that goes for not just like the forms that people are attracted to, but the business as well. When I first started working on Where Cards Fall, there was no Apple Arcade, which is what ended up giving us our big break and like the chance to actually make this game with a proper budget and get it out there to a wide audience. I just had to wait. I had to wait until something that felt like it was the right opportunity for the game came along. I tend to think those things do surface if you persevere and just stick with it, and your idea is strong and your work is strong.
So I was when I prepare for these, I read a lot of articles and interviews with people such as you, and I came across one that you had a quote in there that I really thought was interesting, and I wanted you to kind of describe and elaborate on, which was that you said that you feel that game design is an invisible art. What do you mean by that, and why is that important?
Yeah, I said that in it was in Apple deep dive into
Right.
into where cards fall, and I think they didn't put in that interview, but what I'd started it off with was a quote from Steve Jobs that I always really liked, which was that design is how it works, and I really think that is like a general truth in all forms of design. Like it is not something that you can easily point to and say like, this is what I did. It is more something that you feel. You know, it isn't seen. It is something that is understood with how you interact with whatever the actual form is. So, you know, when you look at types of design like architecture, you know, how you move through a space. Like if you go into a beautifully designed building, every aspect of it is intentional. Like the way that you navigate through a gorgeous lobby is intentional. The way that the sun shines through a window and highlights specific features is all intentional and thought through by somebody. And most people never consciously experience that or never consciously think about it, but they do appreciate it just by how they feel when they're navigating that space. And I think game design is very much that. Like, you know, a lot of times when friends and family that you don't really play games ask me like, what do I do? It's usually like, do you program or do you like do the art for a game? And like aspects of both, but it's not the fundamentals of it. Like the main thing is deciding how things fit together, how things work to create an experience that, you know, players are going to engage with, and we want them to engage with it in a specific way that they may or may not recognize. But what they do appreciate it if it all kind of works together harmoniously.
Nice. Speaking of harmoniously, Daniel asks that he says, first of all, he notices you have lots of instruments on your wall of your apartment.
Yep.
And so assuming you are a musician of some sort, he asks, does it make it easier to communicate with the sound designers and composers that you work with? And, you know, how involved are you with working with these musical creators? Or do you even create your own music for the games?
I mean, I play music as a hobby. I don't think I'm good enough to like actually meaningfully contribute to any of the games that I work on. But I'm really fortunate because my main collaborator on the music side is Torrin Borodale, who went to school with me. He's a terrific composer. He's written music for movies like Searching, and he wrote the music for Where Cards Fall. And Torrin has taught me a lot about like how to direct musicians and people with you know, audio sensibilities. He likes to be directed by emotional phrases rather than like specific like, you know, could you just, you know, like literally like adjust the volume here or or you know, change this exactly to like this type of musical phrase. He responds better to, I would like this scene to feel you know, nerve-wracking, or this is a scene where the character is going through a you know, a major life change, which is about X, Y, and Z. And I did a lot of reading about, you know, how different film directors kind of just directed their, or film directors with like very specific musical choices. I kind of arrived at those. And the one that I was really focused on for Where Cards Fall was Donnie Darko, which is such an interesting choice for its soundtrack. Richard Kelly directed it, and he wrote like there's a book of interviews with him where he talked about how he made a playlist for every scene in the game, or not in the game, in the movie, where he would choose like a particular song to go with every scene, so that the composer or the people that were choosing the music would understand what it was supposed to feel like. And I did the exact same thing for Where Cards Fall. For every single scene in the game, I ended up like choosing a song that I felt like accurately represented the tone, gave that playlist to Torrin, and it helped him a lot. And then Christy Nupp was the audio director on Where Cards Fall, and she was very similar in that she also really liked to have more kind of emotion as the key, is like the core director mantras, rather than anything that would step on her toes too much. And then she and Torin work together very harmoniously. So Torin he's a great, one of the things that makes him such a great composer is that he doesn't try to like overstate his influence. Like he wants the stories and the emotions from the story to be conveyed by what is on screen, and the music to be an accent rather than to be the crutch. And it's very easy to go in the other direction, to like rely on the music to convey the emotion of whatever the scene is. And then he and Christy worked really well together in that, Christy was developing a lot of the ambiences that make up the world of Where Cards Fall in conjunction with Torin's music. And they would, if like they were working on a scene that took place in the woods, the two of them together would find like the right texture to go with the music that would go with it.
Right. Nice. How many of those songs on that playlist were Radiohead songs?
I think just one, honestly. And there's a lot of different stuff in there. One of the ones that was on there was Vanderwall Crybaby Geeks, which ended up in the launch trailer for the game. It's a song by The National. That was cool. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about your latest creation, which is Blaseball. First of all, where the heck did this game come from? This thing is nuts.
Yeah. It came from, there's two reasons that Blaseball exists. Two main reasons. One of them is very practical, which is that after Where Cards Fall came out, we were pitching other projects, and it was taking a long time to get anything off the ground again. What I would have loved to do was, before Where Cards Fall came out, start pitching, and then like hopefully by the time it's out, we're like ready to go with our next thing. In the games industry, it typically takes at minimum 6 months to get a deal inked to get your next project going. So our game came out, and I was looking at our runway, and I was getting nervous, and we were pitching other projects, and we weren't getting as much traction as I was hoping for. So I was talking to a lot of my mentors about what to do, and one of them said, "You have an awesome team. Why don't you just make a game?" And like our last game, it was like a decade-long-ish project. So I was like, "Well, how are we going to make a game that we can get out there before we run out of money?" And that was like the design constraint at the beginning. This was a game that had to be made on the side while we still were focusing on other projects that we were pitching, and it had to be made by a few people on the team as fast as possible. So I was working with that, and at the same time, I was on a lot of Zoom calls with friends of mine, and to this day, most of my closest friends don't play or care about video games, which is great for inspiration. And we were playing like a web-based, browser-based version of a card game, and it was like not particularly well made, but they really wanted to play it because it was just like something that felt kind of normal-ish, during this time. And I was like, this is interesting. Like they're willing to put up with some lack of polish generally here for an experience that brings us together. So I was like, well, what if we make something that can be played more passively, can be played by a lot more people, and can also bring people together during this time? And I pitched the team the next day on a social simulation game where you're betting fake money on simulated versions of horse races. And they loved the like social simulation aspect of it. They did not love the horse racing aspect of it. So Joel was right off the bat like, it can't be horse racing. Like maybe it's like snail racing or something at least like a little bit more interesting than that. Right. So we like talked about that for a little bit, and then we're like, well, what if it was baseball? A game that like it just felt like a better fit for a couple of reasons. Like one, from a scoping standpoint, the experience of like looking at baseball scores on your phone is just looking at the bases and the box score. Like that's it. So we're like, okay, we don't have to have any visuals except for the bare minimum, and like the narrative that you're following along is just like who's up to the plate, who's pitching, what's the outcome of that. So that was where we started. We're like, this feels like something that we could actually do in a short amount of time and it's going to be so systemic. Like it's going to be focusing mostly on emergent systems, which is a lot easier to start with than dumping a ton of resources into making content. And we didn't need to put any artists on or any animator on it too. So it fit my constraints, and it was a game that we were really excited about and felt perfect for the time. So we got to work on it.
Nice. Now I know that, I mean, that was a very smart move to limit your art resources and all that. Although I have to admit, I really would love to see the team mascots for each of the games. So maybe in the future, we can see my team is the tacos, and I want to see
nice.
my taco mascot. So
the way to see it is to go on Twitter and look at all the fan art that's been made.
Yeah, I know.
Different interpretations of what
that's true.
is.
Yeah, I might have to draw my own actually.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, were you surprised at how popular the game became?
Yes, definitely. When we were making it, we thought there was a chance that it would become popular. Like we wouldn't have spent time on it if we didn't think like there was any hope for this game. But we didn't expect this level of popularity. Like one of the games that inspired it was Universal Paperclips, which is a game that we really loved.
Great.
And we looked at the success of that game, which like kind of dominated the game design circles for like a few weeks, maybe even longer, a few months. And that was really cool. And we're like, okay, that's what success for this game looks like. Is if it picks up, then at the very least it's talked about a lot, and then maybe we'll be able to like find a path for sustainability for it at that point. So that was like in my mind kind of like the best case scenario, is it becomes like a Universal Paperclips type of success. What I never expected was the attachment, and I should have expected this, I don't know why I didn't, but the attachment to the characters and the attachment to the teams, and the way that, well, the teams we kind of expected because we were making a sports-like sim, but the characters were kind of the impetus for a lot of the fan creations and a lot of the fan art. And we didn't expect like fan art. We didn't expect, to see people like contributing that type of energy, that type of creative energy into the game. And as soon as it started to happen, we realized this was going to go in a much more interesting direction than we had anticipated, and immediately responded to it.
Right. So what is the strangest thing that's come from the fans so far?
Every day. Right now we're in the middle of a lawsuit about the Eat the Rich not pass. God, it doesn't make any sense to just say that out loud, but that is a current event in Blaseball. Every day is something else that's unexpected and crazy. I loved when the fans band together to resurrect Jalen Hot Dog Fingers, our first player that was incinerated. I loved when they organized to create the Snackifiers, where they shelled the entire rotation of the unlimited tacos.
That messed up my team.
Made it much easier for betting strategy, though.
Sure.
Yeah. And I love seeing all the artwork and the creations. Like, I think the Seattle Garage is the band with all of the music they've been making. Like, that to me was the craziest. Like, the fan art was actually like incredibly good, and it was awesome that we have like an amazing community that's very, very talented. But like full-length albums, based on stuff that's happening in the game, like that is well beyond anything that I possibly could have imagined. And I love the albums too. Like I listen to them all the time. They're great. So that stuff is just such a delight.
Yeah, it's nice to have talented fans, right? All right, so
definitely.
So my question on behalf of everybody is, should I be eating my peanuts or should I be hoarding them?
Well, this is a game about choosing your own outcomes. So I'm going to let you make that choice for yourself.
Well, they are so delicious, but I don't know if they're going to be helpful for anything else. So it's such a conundrum.
Well, they already powered up the Hall Stars. So they did something.
Yeah, that's true. They do something. Yeah. So what has this taught you about like creating lore for games? This is obviously the thing that people have gravitated towards, and I think part of it, of course, is the fact that they feel such a strong ability to affect it, resurrecting dead players and screwing up lineups of teams. What about this lore? And it's a very, wacky world that you're already creating here, being made even wackier by the fans. But why is that so important to any game?
Yeah, stories are just like, speak very broadly about stories for a second. Like, it's just one of the like natural ways that people communicate and make sense of things. And there's so many different ways of telling them. And one of the reasons that I started to like explore video games is because I thought their narrative potential was very interesting and very different. And I wanted to see what we could do with narrative in different ways. So, with Where Cards Fall, we made a game where like we paired the mechanics and the theme like very, very, very closely together so that it would feel like very cohesive. With Blaseball, it's a very different approach where the story is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between what the designers have laid out, what the simulation is presenting, and then what the fans are putting back into it. And that is something that is completely unique to this form. Like it relies on interactivity. It relies on this open dialogue between what the participants are doing and what the designers are giving back. So I think that itself is really, really interesting, and it also shows how like so much of what is powerful about Blaseball and about like the stories that people kind of latch onto is not so much like what is literally on the page, but is what is in their mind. What are they seeing that is not there? And one thing that Blaseball I think is really helping to show is like how so many different types of people, when they engage with media and art, they see things in dramatically different ways. And to have like one game that supports all of these different interpretations and encourages competing interpretations, but like allows for both of them to coexist, I think is very special. And it's really neat to just, see, what one player thinks of Jessica Telephone could be completely different from what the next player thinks of Jessica Telephone. And as designers, we love to see all that. And we are constantly looking to see what we want to pull from and what we want to support and just what we want to boost.
You guys think you're going to ever be at a point where you have to decide what these characters look like for purposes of, the game, or, if you do anything like a spin-off or anything with this, this universe?
The short answer is we're going to basically no. Like we're going to work as hard as possible to never have to like put our own like canonical stance on that. Like all right. Of the there's certain things in the game that that we present that are like canon, and those are the things that are on the website. That's the team
when they're not redacted,
or the forbidden book, like things like that. Like those are presented by us and for you to interpret, for you to come up with your own spin on. But since Blaseball is so stripped back and we don't put imagery on top of it, that gives you free reign to kind of tell us what you're seeing. And we definitely want to keep that the case. Like I think it would kind of violate sort of a bit of trust that we have and the dialogue that we've created with the community to put our own stamp on some of those things.
Well, I am reminded of the Adventure Zone podcast, which is a podcast that I enjoy. And for many, the show had been going for several years, and they were in a very similar situation where they were like, we're never going to show what Taco really looks like. We're never going to show what, Merle, or whatever, any of these characters. But eventually it became so popular that they eventually had to, they were like, oh, we want to do a comic book. Well, you can't do a comic book where, it's just a blank. you have to show what these characters look like. So just be prepared that you might have to eventually, if you follow the pattern of success of at least the McElroy brothers, you might end up having to figure out what these guys look like.
So I'll say this: we've talked about all those avenues, and we have ideas for those avenues that would not change the way that we've been approaching it so far, and would still reward what the community is doing.
Gotcha.
So
Nice.
if we do go down the route of like a comic book or anything else that, would have visuals attached to it, we're going to do it in a way that feels very much in the spirit of Blaseball.
Gotcha. All right. So I'll get my fan art created now, so then you can adapt some of the designs later for. All right. So speaking of which, Blaseball, you guys started working on this when?
In April.
April. So, all right.
Yeah.
So let me ask you. Perfect. This perfect kind of ending question before we get into the question and answers. So
Sure.
if you have question and answers, please put them in there and we'll get to them in a minute. And that is the question of development during quarantine. What is it like? How did you find success despite this moderately daunting environment we're all living in? Right. I mean, some people have been like, their spirits have been crushed, obviously, and it's hard to be creative in this environment. Like, what did you guys do to be able to create something that's not only got made, but is a success in this environment?
I bought a gigantic microphone so that everybody could hear me. Yeah, I hated it at first. I still love it, but it was such a 180 from the way that we had made Where Cards Fall. We were the type of studio where we were all together in person, incredibly collaborative, and whenever somebody had a question, they'd come ask. We'd all be working like in, a few different rooms, but everybody's like just running around, going to people's desks, showing people their work. We had a lot of like in-person meetings and design discussions, and I'm the type of person that gets energy around my team. So I really, really missed, just kind of seeing everybody and hearing their voices and that just the energy of the design discussions that we would have. So it was a lot about like replicating that and also taking advantage of the advantages that being in your home or elsewhere offers. So first and foremost, we have a lot of Zoom calls, but we usually do them without the camera on, so that we can be like doing whatever we need to be doing. I'm the type of person that often likes to pace around when I'm having ideas. So I can do that without looking insane now, which I really appreciate. But also, we scheduled out the time a little bit more. So we weren't going to be able to have a lot of these impromptu design discussions like we did when we were in the studio. What we did instead was we have our version of a writer's room that starts at 1:00 every day, and it goes usually 2 to 3 hours, sometimes more, depending on what's needed in Blaseball. And we have that every single day to just talk like as much as we need to about the different problems that we're facing and where we're hoping that the story will go. That's very, very helpful because it's just like normal conversation and has kind of a little bit of that energy that we were missing before too. And I think the other thing that it just has made us do is become much more hyper aware of our processes. So, things that could slide when you're in person and you can rely on the fallback communication just doesn't slide anymore. So, we have to kind of over communicate, and we document a lot more than we used to. Even as a small team, like when you're small and you're in person, at least we usually would fall into the habit of not documenting that much. I think we would do it more so than a lot of other small studios, but still it wasn't like a huge part of the design process. Now it is like our documentation for Blaseball is probably more extensive than it ever was for Where Cards Fall at this point, even though it's a web game with no visuals, which is kind of crazy to think about. But it has to be that way for us to keep organized and to stay on top of everything that we're doing.
Nice. What about as Blaseball becomes a bigger thing, and you might have to reach out to other contributors, or even moving forward into whatever you guys work on next. What suggestions would you have for somebody in this current climate to be able to network or to find collaborators within this situation we're in?
I had a huge advantage, and I already had an amazing video game design team. So, that's a hard one to answer. I might turn to the people that are already doing this in like the Blaseball community. There's just so many people that have met each other through this game and are creating artwork together, creating stories together, and sharing ideas together. So I think finding a space that is naturally drawing you and peers like you, and contributing to that space, like that's really what community is all about. And those communities can exist online too, and we're really grateful to have a wonderful one surrounding this game.
Great. That's awesome. All right. So let me go to the Q&A and see what some of our attendees have posted. So actually, Katie and Perry are asking questions that are not similar, but I think they can be kind of themed together, which is that the current state of puzzle games are either the reaction is that they're taking a traditional puzzle game and recontextualizing it. Perry mentions Tetris 99, that I don't know if you're familiar with that, but
Yep.
Tetris being a very classic, rotate and drop puzzle game, and they're literally turning it into a battle royale. Versus Katie is bringing up point and click adventures, which have undergone a big resurgence in popularity, particularly with what Telltale was doing and stuff like that. But do you think that these recontextualizations of them is improving the genre, or do you think that there's still room to grow within the structure of the genre itself?
Yeah, I think all of these experiments are experiments on kind of different axes, and they're all very interesting. I personally love seeing the very classic games get a modern update, whether that's like the massively multiplayer version of it, like with Tetris, or the VR version of like Tetris Effect was another really interesting one, and Res Infinite, which I feel like kind of goes along the same lines, where these are like what the additional perspective of putting a headset on can give to this very kind of classic form. I think that's interesting. And then there's the adventure game style ones that we talked about earlier, and what's great about adventure game style puzzle games is that they can evolve as like the technology and interaction models evolve in a very natural way. If you think about games like Myst, which was really kind of based around what you could do with the mouse, and interacting with like different objects on the screen. I think what some of the interesting stuff that we're seeing applied to more modern form factors like touch and VR. I think of the Room series right away, where the Room focuses, very tactile interactions. It brought that first to iOS and created adventure game style puzzles within that, like all context based. And then their most recent release is a VR title that is showing what you can do with the additional perspective that offers. So I think those are very healthy ways for the genre to grow, to be using more modern forms to kind of explore these more kind of like classic approaches. I will say that when we start to think about like what we want to be working on, we don't start with genre almost ever. It is really about like what is the kind of overall type of experience that we're trying to make, whether it's from like an emotional standpoint or from a like broader design goal standpoint. So with Where Cards Fall, it was like a game that is expressing human fragility, and with Blaseball, it was a game that is bringing people together while they are in isolation. Like those are kind of like the broader design goals that we're starting with. And then we're finding the genres that feel the most appropriate for them and taking pieces from those and pieces from others. And that's how at least our process works. So, we never really go into something saying like our next game is going to be a puzzle game or a racing game or something. It is much more of like, here's the type of experience that we want to make. And, we all have designed tons of different types of games. We've all worked on tons of different types of experiences. Let's find the pieces that feel like they would be the most natural fits.
Right. Or you find somebody you want to make the game for and you say, what would be a good game for them? Right?
Yeah, totally.
Nice. Do we have any more questions from our attendees? Oh, we do. Let's see. No? Anyone? All right. Well, then I will go ahead and ask, what is next for Sam Rosenthal?
I'm taking it day by day right now.
All
Baseball is
are.
a nonstop, crazy thing, and we're focusing on a lot of different, honestly, a lot of different things right now. Like one is with this game and this community that's grown, around the game. We want to continue to foster that and to make it as good as it possibly can be on all levels. We also want it to be sustainable for the company, both from a like financial standpoint of being able to have everybody like paid properly and living healthy lives. Also from a workload standpoint, like after this week, we're going on a hiatus for a little bit as we prepare the next era of baseball and also just rest because this is a 24/7 live game and is absolutely exhausting to work out as much fun as it is. And that's very needed too. So we're looking to figure out like what those practices are. And then at the same time, like we're not outside of that initial problem that got us into baseball to begin with, which is, we need to get projects off the ground to keep the studio afloat. And, as we try to make baseball a project that will do that, we also have to focus on other avenues that could do that too. So, unfortunately, it's impossible to dedicate all of our resources and energy into one thing as we're a small studio that is just trying to survive too.
Right. All right. Actually, we got a couple more questions. Good.
Cool.
Tylak asks, what would you recommend for someone looking to get into creating games, or is there anything you wish you had known when you started?
It's a really good question. So much is the short answer to that. I think, okay, this is going to sound pretty general, but I hope it's helpful. One thing that I didn't really realize when I started directing games really was how every decision that you make, every small decision that you make has so many ripples across so many different types of people and departments. So, like if you make the decision, I'm going to try to think of like the simplest one, the doors are going to close in your game. Then somebody has to animate those doors. You have to figure out like how they're going to, move in the first place, how you're going to interact with them. So designer has to work on that. Somebody has to create the sound for it. There's just so many different types of people that decision touches, and that's a really small one. So if you think about like a much larger one, I think like one of the things that I had to like kind of really work on understanding when I first started directing games was thinking through the potential repercussions of every suggestion that I would make, so that we could make sure that they were not only feasible but weren't making anybody pull their hair out too. And
Right,
I'd say
when you run a studio, you are the person in charge, and so everything you say carries weight, even if you're saying it in a offhanded even if you're like, well, I'm not sure about this or not, but you say it, and then people go, oh my God, this is what we have to do. This is the new marching order.
Yeah, totally. I'm really grateful that I've had a number of great producers work with me over, my time as a studio head, and they've all been much more experienced than me. So they've helped me, fill in those gaps and understand the weight of those decisions and like the best ways to articulate those types of things as well. I'd say that's a really, really big one. I had another one that I thought of, but I forgot it already. I'm sorry. But as far as like advice as to getting started, like before I talked about just kind of meeting people that you enjoy working with, I think like finding your crew is a really great place to start. Reading about games, trying to understand them. A lot of ways that people get started with. There's different ways to get started. Like you can prototype, on paper. You can. What a lot of people do is they try to kind of emulate games that they like to understand how they work, which is a really good practice, like game cloning in a way. Like don't release that stuff because you don't want to, like copy anybody's work. But from a game design perspective, that's a really great way to start to understand, just how these things actually work and how they fit together and how, games feel the way that they do.
All right. Just make like your mentor said, just make a game. Right?
Just make a game. Sounds easy, right?
Yeah, I know. It's so easy, right?
Yeah.
And everybody gives that advice. but it's harder to get going, than
Yeah.
it sounds. So in hand with the idea of you running a studio, what about starting one? Like, what advice, or what are some of the challenges that you came across when you started one?
Yeah, I think I got into video game design because I wanted to be an artist, and I wanted to explore new boundaries and stuff with this really cool form. With the way that this industry works, like, you have to also be an entrepreneur if you're going to do that. It's just kind of the path. Like, it's a studio driven industry. You have to have a company. You have to find, like, you have to have some sort of like commercial entity that can put out all of this stuff. So one of the things that I had to figure out basically early on was, how do you actually run a business outside of just having a lot of like cool game ideas and the ability to prototype them. So before I started the game band, I like kind of binged a whole bunch of like company business podcasts, and did Stanford has like a bunch of like free business courses online, and I just like did them so that I could understand the workings of what it's like to run a studio before I actually tried it. And also had some great mentors and friends help me with those initial steps of just like getting incorporated, and getting like just the fundamentals that you need, understanding how the taxes work and all of that. And these are all things that like are not fun to think about as a game designer, but they're important to think about when you're running a company. Because at the end of the day, like, none of us at the game band got into this because like we want to make games so that we can become billionaires. Like, that's not the idea. We want to make games because we want to make games. We want to express things within this form, but like, we have to also find ways to make them commercially viable so that we can continue to exist and continue to do so. That is the nature of it right now. So we have to really be
nature of it
astute businessmen as well.
I was gonna say, it's the nature of it always, right? The goal is to make successful games so you can keep making games. Nobody wants to stop making games. Making games is awesome.
Yeah, totally. And it gets into a whole other discussion about like there's no other support system in the US for the arts like this, right? Like, it's just, this is the way right now. So we have to find a way to work within it.
Nice. Now, if I know that Blaseball has a Patreon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where can people find that if they want to help support a great game company?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's patreon.com/Blaseball. And we're grateful for the Patreon. It's doing pretty well for us so far. The game is not profitable yet, so we could really use any support that you could give us. It really does help a lot. And we've got a couple tiers in there that are really fun. There's one where you can contribute a name to our name pool. Our most recent one is going to let you be an audience member and a participant in talks like this that we're going to have once a month. I'm really looking forward to getting started on.
Nice. It's a good thing you have that big microphone.
What's all about.
And is it possible for our guests to reach out to you afterwards and if they have any more questions, where would be a good place for them to find you?
So you can email me, sam@thegameband.com. I'm Sam Rosenthal on Twitter. That's a really good place these days for me. Like, I was not on Twitter that much prior to Blaseball. These days I'm on Twitter quite a lot. I kind of have to be. So I'm checking it a lot if you want to DM me there.
Right. Nice. Well, cool. Well, thank you so very much for spending the time talking with us. It was so great to catch up and find out a lot more, some great insights into all these wonderful games that you have created. So keep up the awesome work. As your former educator, I am always proud to brag about my students. And I always say, look, one of my students, look what he made. It's so great. So keep up the good work. Thanks
what a lot for the opportunity, Scott. It's great to talk to you.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So, and to all of you in the audience, thank you so very much for attending. Like I said, we do more of these. Just join our meetup group. And we have upcoming workshops for animation, for game design. We have more great Masters of Game Design speakers in the near future. And if you want more information, please go to the New York Film Academy and check out our website and click on the games department. You can find out about all the awesome programs and faculty that we have associated with our school. We would love to have you come and become students. Then that way I'll get to teach you how to make games. So from all of us here at the New York Film Academy, thank you again for attending. Have a great night and weekend, and please stay safe.
Take care.